Amanda Rishworth, welcome to the program.
Great to be with you.
So your plan to lift the rate of JobSeeker by $40 a fortnight, as announced in the budget, we know, but there was also meant to be an indexation increase on top of that, and you've been waiting for the latest inflation data. Are you able to now confirm what that increase will be?
Yeah, our policy design for the increase of JobSeeker made it very clear that the $40 would be applied before indexation. It's due on the same date as our increase on the 20th of September. I'm able to confirm that that rate will be $56. So JobSeekers over a fortnight will get $56 extra. In addition, that extra indexation will also be applied to our Commonwealth rent assistance that we announced in the budget. 15% increase on the maximum rates and inflation applied after. So the support that people will get through that if they're on the maximum rate will be between 18 to 37 extra dollars a fortnight.
Okay, so just on JobSeeker, the $40 plus 16 from indexation, what's the rate of that indexation that you've settled on there?
The rate of indexation is being calculated at 2.2% for the preceding 6 months from January to July.
So only a 2.2% increase in indexation. How did you arrive at that figure?
Well, that's what the CPI figures are for the 6 months. Obviously, a JobSeeker is indexed every 6 months. So in March, there was a 3.7% indexation applied. There's been 2 indexations, but importantly, we didn't do the indexation and then add the $40. The $40 was incorporated, so the full amount, including our increase to the base rate, has been applied. So we're looking at maximising the support that people do get.
I'm just wondering, that indexation rate, even if you put the two of them together, you're only getting to around 6% over the year. A lot of basic costs for people on JobSeeker have gone up more than that. In fact, we can show you some of them here. You can see over the 12 months, food and non-alcoholic beverage up 7.5%, rent 6.7%, gas more than 22%, electricity more than 10%. So is what you're doing enough? Well,
firstly, that is the indexation, but we've increased the base rate of JobSeeker as well by 40%. But that's not the only cost of living measures we've taken. As I said, Commonwealth rent assistance, the largest increase in Commonwealth rent assistance that goes to 1.1 million Australians will benefit as a result of that. We've got our energy price reductions, which will focus on concession card holders, and of course our tripling of the bulk billing incentive, which is focused once again for those on the lowest incomes, those that have children. So you've got to look at these cost of living measures in their entirety.
So you've just announced the JobSeeker increase will be $56, and the Commonwealth rent assistance, which I think was a 15% rise, was it in the budget? So that will be a bit more.
That's correct.
What's the...
Add inflation, so 17.2.
Okay. What about some of the other payments, like single parent payment and so on? Have you worked out those figures yet?
We haven't worked out those figures. Some of the other measures like pension and single parent payment has a choice of indexation measures, so we've got to work through those indexation measures. But CPI, of course, is particularly high at the moment, and so it is likely that CPI will be the highest of the number of measures that are looked at.
When you were making this decision in the budget on the $40, you set up a group called the Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee, brought together business unions, social security experts, economists and so on to give you specific advice on this. It recommended lifting the JobSeeker rate to $875 a fortnight, 90% of the age pension, they said. Just remind us why you said no to that.
Well, of course, the Economic Inclusion Committee was providing a very specific advice on the level of JobSeeker to inform the budget process. Of course, the budget process has to take in a range of different factors, including a responsible structural adjustments, but also, of course, as the Treasurer said, making sure that we're not adding to inflation. So there is a lot of issues that we do have to weigh up in a budget process. The economic inclusion...
So just to be clear on that, you couldn't afford it and you're worried about pushing up inflation?
Well, there's a number of aspects that were considered in our careful calibration of the budget.
But are they the two reasons?
Well, there were a number of factors considered in why we would increase, for example, JobSeeker, but also rent assistance, also restoring single parenting payment. There are a number of actual issues we addressed. Our focus.
I'm just trying to ask what those are, and it's affordability.
Our focus across the board of our budget was helping particularly those doing it the toughest. If you look at, we are providing cost of living relief across the board, but of course those doing it toughest was where our focus was on.
I'm just
asking that's what guided us.
Why you couldn't do what your experts were asking you to do? It's because you couldn't afford it, was the answer.
Well, there's competing different viewpoints, but of course the budget is one of those. Budget considerations is one of those. And we carefully calibrated in a number of areas. Rent assistance being another area. Of course, the single parenting payment. Now, that was not a recommendation necessarily from the EAC. It was a recommendation from the Women's Economic Task Force. So we had advice coming in from a range of different areas.
And I think they were all saying go beyond where you did. But obviously, your argument at the time was, the budget was in deficit. You were worried about what you could afford. Turns out, though, the budget is going to be in surplus, more than $20 billion for that financial year, as the Treasurer has said. Is there room for any further relief now that you can see the size of this surplus?
Well, of course, the changes we're making, whether it's to rent assistance, JobSeeker, are structural changes. They're ongoing increases that will be applied. So when you talk about the surplus from last year, it's a very different circumstance to the reforms that we've made, which are ongoing and structural. Now, we have calibrated these to be responsible, to help people that are doing it tough, but also that they're sustainable into the long term.
So what do you say to those who no doubt will welcome any sort of increase but still facing these increasing costs? Inflation is still rising. Will there be any further help this financial year?
Well, what we have coming in, of course, is this extra support flowing on the 20th of September. That is, of course, if our bill, our safety net bill, passes the Parliament in the next fortnight.
Do you think it will, just on that?
Well, I'll be urging everyone in the Senate, people need relief now, and I'll be urging the Senate to pass our safety net bill. It is really a matter for the Greens, for the Coalition, for the crossbench of whether that bill gets passed. But we've been pretty clear that we want to provide this support.
And that's it for this financial year?
And we want it flowing from the 20th of September. Of course, in addition to that, we have energy relief flowing, which people will start seeing in their bills from the 1st of July. Of course, the tripling of the bulk billing incentive, rent assistance. It is really a pretty wholesome package to cover a number of areas.
Let's turn to another aspect of your portfolio. A Senate inquiry into consent laws was held during the week. A consistent theme was the complication of different legal definitions of consent in different states and territories. Now, harmonising them would help, but I suppose only if it's best practice that's being applied. What would you like to see?
Well, I'd like to see that we do work together with states and territories to see strong consent laws. I think that is really important. But we also know that there is a lot of educative work to do out there on what consent means. The research does show that people are confused. People have different interpretations of what consent actually means. And indeed, a lot of people don't want to talk about it. If they can avoid talking about consent, they will. People don't know how to have those conversations with their children either. So this is a big area of need that our country needs to tackle for education, but also for laws to be consistent.
Well, just on some of those laws, should the age of consent be 16 or 17?
Well, look, that is absolutely a matter to work through with states and territories. Well, when we're actually talking about consent, what we're actually talking about is a positive conversation that both people engaging in sexual intercourse or anything really, any intimate activity, are actually both willing participants. That's actually the nub of it. It's not the age of necessarily that's where the focus is. When we're talking about consent...
Does that age matter in law?
Well, the age matters in law between jurisdictions.
What should it be?
Well, to be honest, that is a matter for states and territories to work through. When we talk about consent, what we're actually talking about is making sure that young people, as well as older people, have a proper understanding about what it means to give consent to intimacy.
Are you talking about affirmative consent? In other words, active consent being given rather than assumed consent? Because the states differ on this as well. Where do you stand on this?
Well, that's something that is actually being discussed at the moment.
What's your position?
I want to work with states and territories about what that looks like. I think we need strong consent laws, of course.
Affirmative consent, Minister? I'm just asking if you support this.
I mean, there's one of the issues around this area is it is a very grey area. And for example, there's been established situations where a woman's been passed out and someone thinks it's okay then to sexually assault her.
Which is why many argue affirmative consent is important. Yet in states like your own, South Australia, that's not the law as I understand it.
Well, they are currently working across the board on reforming their consent laws as well.
Can you take a position on this?
Well, I want to work with states and territories. I think, for example, harmonising the laws across the country is critically important, but we need to educate people about this. There is such a poor level of education, and I'm telling you, milkshake ads, which is what the previous government thought was consent education, it just won't cut it.
Well, speaking of education, big focus of those hearings during the week was universities and what's going on. There's some shocking numbers. The last national survey found 275 students are sexually assaulted in university settings every week. And that survey was done at the peak of COVID, when presumably a lot of students weren't on campus. Is it time to get some more accurate data about what's going on at universities?
Well, I do think there needs to be transparency about what's going on at universities and right across the country.
A new national survey?
Well, look, I'm going to work with the Education Minister to look at what can be done. But
do you want a new national survey?
Well, what I want to see is those numbers reduce on campus. I want to see the numbers of sexual assault and sexual harassment.
I'm sure everyone does.
Should
we have some more accurate data than this?
Well, data is key.
So a new national survey?
Well, data is key to making sure that we can actually deal with the problem. But it's not just about more data. What we need to see, and universities are in a really unique position for this, is actually interventions. Interventions to actually ensure that younger people starting university have information on consent, understand what sexual assault is. And universities are in a unique position. And quite frankly, I don't think universities have been doing enough on this.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because before the 2019 election, Labor promised an independent task force to hold universities to account for what's going on with sexual assault and harassment on their campuses. There was the threat of penalties and even withholding funding if they weren't doing enough. Tanya Plibersek said at the time for excuses, the time for talk is over. What's happened to that commitment?
Well, myself and Jason Clare have been working very closely together on what universities can do. We've now got a new national plan to end violence against women and children, and it's clear that everyone's got to take responsibility, including our universities.
Do we need an independent task force as Labor promised back then?
Well, I want to see universities take the responsibility seriously. I want to see them actually intervene to make sure that they're providing education on campus, and I want to see them work with the government on this. I know that Minister Clare is very interested in continuing that conversation with universities.
Is a task force on the table, or is that
I will work with Minister Clare on this, but what's really clear is the status quo is not good enough.
Okay. Final one, Minister, child protection. One of the Close the Gap targets is reducing the number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children in out-of-home care. You've commenced a formal partnership of what's called shared decision-making with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders on this. Can you explain how that works and how it also might work alongside an Indigenous voice?
Yeah, look, for the first time ever, the Ministerial Council on Child Protection, which involves me as the Commonwealth lead, but also every state and territory, agreed to work in a different way to reduce the out-of-home care. And that is including equal numbers of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders meeting and making decisions with Commonwealth and state ministers, co-chaired together. Aboriginal leaders on this have said they finally got hope for the first time that we will implement things like the Indigenous Child Protection Placement Principles. So this is a new way of working, of actually sharing power, and this is an exact example of how the voice would work, providing advice and intel and information. One of the things that's come out from that process is, unlike what seems to be in the wider community, this sense that everything the voice, every bit of advice the voice will provide will be combative, I know the ministers around the table have found it really helpful. It has guided what we can do to make a difference, and it is going to lead to practical changes on the ground. So this is a really good example of doing things differently, of providing a voice and ensuring that we actually get practical outcomes.
Amanda Rishworth, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.